everyone, Steve from the Audiophiles. Welcome. This is an exciting episode. I got to interview Tom Port from Better Records, his inaugural YouTube interview. Very, very fascinating. It was a great chat. I want to share it with you now, but before that, please hit that subscription button. It helps me out a ton. It really does. Please enjoy this interview. Leave some comments. Love to hear your thoughts on Tom Port and his betterrecords.com website and his business model. So we'll see you on the other side of the Audiophiles. Good. Hi, everyone. This is Steve Westman from the Audiophile. A very special episode today. We've got Mr. Tom Port from Better Records. And I will say this is your inaugural YouTube, I guess, interview or chat, first one ever. So welcome to what we call the vinyl community. And I mean, your name has come up a lot in the last little while, and I'm sure you're aware of it with, yes, the Geoff Edgers Washington Post article that came out. I think it was October 25th, around there. So welcome to the Audiophiles. Thank you, Tom, for doing this.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
I knew that.
I got really calm right there because people think I'm a hothead, but no, I'm a very calm person.
Well, I know a lot will be watching this chat today when it gets uploaded onto my channel. So maybe
let me just say, following up on my stupid joke. So my video on that Geoff Edwards did, where
Edgers,
Tom, yeah, Edgers. Didn't I say that? Oh, where Edgers said that. He always picked the parts where I was screaming and running off of the mouth and losing, and my hair was on fire. But I'm actually very calm.
Well, from what we've been chatting, you seem very calm as well. So let's get right into it. I mean, Geoff Edgers came down to your office to see what Better Records is all about. Maybe you want to first tell the viewers what Better Records is, or betterrecords.com is the website, first of all.
Well, we're the guys behind the whole concept of hot stampers. What we do is we take 10 copies of a record and we clean them all up. We have a staff of 10 people. So I have a woman that just cleans records for us. And then I have two guys sitting there playing the records all day. And the person playing the record at the turntable doesn't tell the person listening to the record what copy it is. So the person listening and making notes has no idea what pressing it is. You can't tell by the label. For example, if you're doing a Beatles record, Sgt. Pepper would be a good example. All the labels are the same. They're all from the 70s. We don't play the originals. We don't like them. And so that's enough to get everybody all upset with me already. But moving on from there. And so then the best copy sounds the best. They all sound different. We give them grades. We've set up a grading system of our own. And at some point they get play graded by somebody with a pair of headphones and a turntable just to listen for the surface noise. And then they get uploaded on our site and then they sell. And then people write us letters about how great they sound. And that's kind of the full circle of life right there, man.
Sounds pretty. How long have you been doing this for? Like, how long has your company been in existence?
Well, I've been around I've been selling records since 1987. But I have to tell you, when I got into this business in 1987, I sold a lot of audiophile records. I sold a lot of mobile fidelity records. I sold whatever I thought other audiophiles would buy. And I've done many mea culpas about that. I feel bad about all the people that bought records from me back in the day when I didn't know what I was doing. And at some point, 2004, as a matter of fact, we started doing these hot stamper shootouts where we would take just a big pile of records. And there's a picture on my blog of our blood, sweat, and tears inventory, and we had something like 42 copies of that record, and almost all of them were 360s. There might have been some red seals in there, and that's because that is the record that really launched me into this whole idea. It's not the only record, there's a bunch of them, but was one because there are so many different stamper numbers for that record, and most of them don't sound good. And so you really had to work hard to find a stamper that sounded good. And then you had to find a copy of that pressing with those stampers that sounded good. And this is all before I really had the best cleaning technologies and all the rest that we eventually were able to get our hands on. And so it was a big job back in those days. But what's interesting about the hot stamper phenomenon and the process of it is, as time has gone on, you have the learning curve. So you're constantly learning. All right, don't buy any more of these. Don't buy any more of those. Buy these, but always keep fresh copies coming in, because that's the way you learn. If you think, it's a big premise on my blog. If you think you already know there is everything there is to know about records, how are you ever going to learn anything? I learn things about records. People say, "Oh, you're such a know-it-all." I learn things about records all the time. We just learned, for example, of an even better stamper for Sergeant Pepper than the one we used to like. Now, I've been listening to that record for a long time, and I've been doing shootouts since about 2005. So that's 17 years worth. We probably played 150 copies of that record, maybe even more than that, and then we learned something, and so that was great. That's what makes.
You're never afraid to make a mistake.
And yeah, that's, if you hear a voice off camera, there's a person over there. It's
That's
my it's my
that's
mail order bride, as you know.
and that's Judy. Hi, Judy.
Yeah, Judy's my lovely wife.
so-
And
So you mentioned at the top about you don't like the. I mean, let's talk about the Beatles. Everyone likes talking about the Beatles. You're not a believer that the original Beatles records on most of, like, let's say, original UK version of, let's say, Abbey Road isn't the best sounding one, or original mono version of Sergeant Pepper.
Yes, I've had the mono original of Sergeant Pepper, and I'm pretty astonished that people think that's a good sounding record. But interestingly enough, I haven't written about this, but I think it's interesting. Parlophone did a reissue series in the early 80s. Now, I am no Beatles expert on this level, but I believe they reissued using the original metalwork for some Beatle records. I know they did Revolver because I had one. It's -1-1, and it's a real UK Parlophone with a reproduction of the original yellow and black label. And I had one of those, and I think they're the monos. I could be wrong. But I did have, so the point I'm making there is that record is findable, and not the arm and a leg that a real Sergeant Pepper original would cost you in good condition, which is many, many hundreds of dollars to get one that's in clean condition. Can you imagine what people did with that record? They played it until the grooves were worn out, because what an amazing experience that must have been. It's like walking into the theater and you heard there's a new Alfred Hitchcock movie, and it turns out to be this movie in black and white called Psycho. And you're watching this movie and your head is exploding because you can't believe what's happening on the screen. Well, that's what happened when people, there's a lot of interviews with famous musicians and people who eventually started bands, and they said, I can't believe, who was it? I forget what musician it was, but he said, I've been sitting there listening to this record. I just can't believe it. We all got to raise our game now. This is setting a whole nother standard for popular music. How are we ever going to write this many good songs and make them sound that way?
It sounds like Brian Wilson saying that.
It might have been. And of course, he ended up being in a sandbox because he could, the Beatles fortunately had plenty of good songwriters, plenty of good people to produce the songs, and to great engineers, Geoff Emerick, obviously, and who I'm a huge fan of, and obviously the productions of everything, and some. Let me just make an aside when we're talking about the Beatles, something I've never written about. I've done big track by track breakdowns for lots of records, a lot of Steely Dan records, 75 different track by track. Here's what you listen for on this track. Here's what you listen for on this track. Here's what we listen for on this track. When this track sounds right, this track should sound dull. If it doesn't sound dull, the record's probably too bright. All this kind of stuff, because that's how deep we have to go into all these records, because we have to find, on any given side of any given record, find the part that's hard to get right. And the part that's hard to get right will tell you when you have a better pressing or a worse pressing. So a lot of these records they all teach us what it is that we should be listening for, because we play the record and say, that's a good example, Scheherazade. I'm going to do a lot of tangential talking here, but Scheherazade starts out with the brass going like this. Ba, ba, ba. Okay. the first 20, 30 seconds, whatever it is that big group of trombones and tubas are playing, it's a make or break. If they don't get that brass right, you can just take that record off and take it down to your local store and get the dollar back that you can get for it, because that is key to the reproduction of that piece of music. And I've seen that piece of music played live, and I've listened to 20 different performances of it, and I know the brass is absolutely essential. So I don't know where I got that from, but so the Beatles. So anyway, so getting back to the Beatles,
Yes.
you can go buy that reproduction of Sergeant Pepper that was put out by Parlophone. That's a -1-1. I'm almost positive you can buy that, and you can listen to it, and you can hear what an original, assuming the metalwork. There's a lot of variability in records. Is the premise of our business. No two records are identical. They're all like snowflakes, and you can get that copy and you can play it, and you can ask yourself if that record sounds good. I don't think it does. I don't think it has any top, and I don't think it has any bottom. I think it's full of congestion. I think it's full of cutter head distortion. But I'm in the minority. A lot of people, we're the anti-original people. We're the people that say, don't believe something is better because it's an original. And I'll tell you a funny story about that, which is just today, I went to my Scheherazade listing. My favorite Scheherazade is the one with Answer Me from 1962, maybe.
Wow.
It's his second performance. He originally played it with the Paris Conservatoire, and then he did it with the Orchestre de la Suisse Romande in 1962, possibly. I could have that date wrong. But the originals don't sound good. You got to get the reissue. If you don't have the reissue, you just do not have a good sounding record. And it's very easy to demonstrate that if you'll come over to my house or come to my studio, and I'll play it for you. But if I just say that on some typing, I do some typing, then why would you believe me? I'm just another guy with an opinion. But I'm the guy that's actually I probably played 50, 60, 70 different copies of Scheherazade, not different performances, but when we get to do a Scheherazade, the Reiner's famous, the Answer Me's are famous, played them, been playing them for 30 years. I'm just that guy that sat down with a big pile of records and started to notice that they all sound different. And then I tried to work through what did I need to do to get to reproduce these records to the highest fidelity I could, and hear what was really on the record, get all the colorations out of my stereo. Once I had done that and I cleaned the records right, they sounded even more different.
And nobody else is listening to their records.
And people have opinions about records. They go, well, let me sell you the record that backs up my opinion. If you have an opinion about a record, I've actually put this on my blog many times. I said, if you know of a good sounding copy of this record, I can't find some heavy vinyl record. If you have your heavy vinyl version sounds better than the one I played, send it to me. Let me hear it. But of course, that never happens because people don't like me.
Well, getting back to the Beatles again. I mean, now when you're talking Sergeant Pepper, was it the mono cut that you find?
No, I'm not a fan of the Beatles records in mono. And
so you don't like this behind me then?
No, I do
2014.
not. I had it. We played I can tell you this. One of my guys that works for me, great guy, lover of the Beatles. He's part of my listing panel. There's only 2 people on it, so he's a key member of my business, and I don't give his name out for whatever reason. He's incognito, but he bought that set and he brought it over, and we played Please Please Me, which I happen to be a giant fan of. And I thought, okay, this will be interesting. Hear it in mono. It's twin track stereo. They put the voices in one channel. They put the instruments in another channel.
Yep.
I happen to like the stereo version of that record. I've never liked the mono version of it. And I basically don't like mono because I don't like all the people crammed into the middle and placed one behind another, which I think is just nonsense, because you could never see any live musicians that were all standing behind each other. How would that ever make any sense? If you go to a jazz group or you go to a rock band, they spread out on the stage and they're from left to right. They're different musicians. Anyway, so we played the Please Please Me, and I just thought it was god awful. It just sounded so terrible. The voice was wrong. It was just a mess. I can't even tell you exactly what I didn't like about it, other than it did not last 2 minutes on my turntable. And I said, okay, if they're going to screw this record up, they probably screwed all the other ones up the way they did with the stereo Beatle box. We played exactly 3 records out of that set. When we got to Let It Be, and we heard how compressed one of the songs was, it's on my blog. They'll tell you what it is. It took all the energy out of it. I just said, you know what? I don't need to play all these records. I heard 3. They don't sound any good to me. My customers don't want to buy those records. My customers want to buy good records. So why am I spending my time playing this box set, which none of my customers would ever want, just in order to beat up on it? I mean, I do enough beating up on heavy vinyl as it is. I made kind of a career out of it, but partly because I wanted to explain to people, this is maybe the sound that you think is acceptable, but I can tell you it's not acceptable to me. And I can send you a record that sounds so much better. You'll never be able to play this box set again. It will just make you sit there going, what was I thinking when I was playing this set? It's terrible.
They should work on their stereotypes.
Anyway, so that's my story.
Well, it's a good story.
For
So
what it
getting,
is, you know, so.
so I guess you probably won't be listening to the new Revolver box set when it comes out on Friday.
Well, what's funny is Geoff Edgers
Edgers.
He knows.
Sent me a clip that's available on YouTube, I believe, of the new mix, the new
Yep.
where they that process, and it was a weird, shiny, digital kind of artifact at the top of the sound, at the very highest frequencies. And he sent it to me and said, "What is that sound up there?" And I said, it's the sound of people making a record who don't know what Revolver is supposed to sound like, because Revolver doesn't have anything up there. So if they give you a version of Revolver and it does have something up there, it's wrong, because nobody who made rock records in 1967 wanted any funny noises up there. But somehow there's a funny noise up there. Now, do I know for sure what that is, or where it comes from, or if my computer speaker created it, or it's on the YouTube video? I don't know any of that, but I will tell you
Was it the Taxman song? Because that was the first one that was released. It's been remixed. It's out on Spotify. Yeah.
It must have been.
So
I played it for 30 seconds and said I typed to Geoff, that doesn't sound right to me.
Yeah.
I'm certainly not going to be buying this thing.
well, because I mean, it was only a 4-track recorder back in '66 when they recorded that, right? So there's no bounce back tapes. So, I mean, all of the, everything was obviously mixed into one. So Giles Martin used Peter Jackson, the director's separation software technology, and basically separated each instrument, each vocal out, and then it was recreated, digitally through Jackson's software.
Well, here's my question to everyone. Why do we assume that all this software is not doing more harm than good? If I personally have never been interested in what people's DACs are for their CD players. I've got this DAC, I've got that DAC. It's like, you know, you've got DAC X and you've got DAC Y. I'll tell you what, why don't we play a CD and determine if your CD player is any good? Let's not worry about what DAC you have. And so when people talk about how records are made,
okay,
what tape was made, what machine cut the record, who cut it, this is all superfluous and unnecessary. As I said in my my video that everybody seems to be offended by, that's okay. I'm a pretty offensive guy in some ways. All these markings in the dead wax are interesting things to look at, but really what you have is a record, and you have to play it, and you have to judge the physical object in your hand and not worry about what you read in the dead wax. Maybe you'll learn some things by the dead wax, but ultimately what you learn is the way you learn is by playing the record. So if Revolver is recreated through some system, I don't care what the system is. I just want to hear Revolver. Does that sound like Revolver to me? No. Okay, I'm not interested in it because there already is a good Revolver. What do I need a different one?
Interesting. And going back, you figure it's the mid '80s Parlophone cuts that are out there for Revolver.
Actually, the late 70s and early 80s were a great time. That's when Harry Moss was cutting all the records, and the Harry Moss versions are all over the map. But when you get a good one, I don't think you can beat them. And that's our here. We have an awful lot of people who've written us an awful lot of letters about our Beatle records, and we stand behind them. And in fact, we think that's how we convert more people than anything, because nobody really says that those records are the best other than we do. And when we send you one and it is the best, then you can believe that we might know what we're talking about.
I would believe that you probably don't like any of the Beatles Capitol cuts that were out there, for the North American cuts. I mean, I personally don't like them. I've got a lot of the Canadian Capitol cuts, and I think they have no top end on them either.
Well, I have to say, Canada is a great country, but they're not a very good country for making records. I've heard very few Canadian pressings, although I have to tell you, I heard a Witch's Brew, you know, the famous Witch's Brew on our sheet. I had a Canadian version of it, and it might have been mastered in America and then sent to Canada for pressing, but it sounded amazing. It sounded every bit as good as my regular American living stereo, which are, as you know, $1,000 a pop for these records, and some wonderful, wonderful music, and impossible to find now because everybody wants it and it sells for a fortune. But I was never able to find another copy, and I went to Discogs and I went to eBay, and I would look around from time to time. It was just hopeless. I don't think a lot of those sold. But there's a Canadian record that was. Oh, I had another record. I had a Leonard Cohen record that had the 3 eyes on the Columbia, and it was like, what is this record? And it was 3 Eye, and I didn't even know anything. There was such a record, but apparently in Canada there was a 3 Eye label, and that record sounded great, and he happens to be from Canada. And I
That's
think
right.
for whatever reason, somebody said, well, he's our hometown boy. We got to make a great sounding record. Never seen another one since. They're rare as hen's teeth, but that's another Canadian record. But that, you know, these are just records that had come my way over the years. If we're going to do a Leonard Cohen shootout, we're going to get as many 360 pressings as we can. They almost always are the best. There's very few red labels until they, you know, after 1970, Columbia produced red labels. Very few red labels compete with the good 360s, but you got to find the right one. You got to find one that was cut right. You got to find one that was pressed right. You got to find one that was treated right. And then you have a hot stamper. So
you said in your interview with Geoff Edgers, I mean, obviously, hot stampers are like snowflakes. No one is the same, just because of the variables when I guess they're pressed at the pressing plant. So you can explain more about that.
Well, all records are different. It's just a function of how revealing your stereo is. Now, there are records that are so close they're almost impossible to tell apart. And that happens. And I'm not going to pretend like if you tested me with 2 really very similar pressings, that I would be able to tell them apart 9 times out of 10. But I can tell you there are big variations in the sound of records with the same stamper numbers. And so when we wrote a commentary a long time ago, 2004 or 5. We were just getting into this, and we called it, somebody asked me, you know, give me the stamper numbers for this Dark Side of the Moon that you're selling. And I said, we don't give out the stamper numbers. And the reason why is because if we say this is the best sounding Dark Side of the Moon, it has these stamper numbers, excuse me, and you go buy a copy of it and it doesn't sound good, that reflects on me. You think I'm wrong or not very good at my job, but your copy doesn't sound like my copy. And I can give you a good example of that. There's a certain audiophile reviewer of some stature, and he had a Coltrane record that basically contained, it's a twofer, and it's got Lush Life in it. And he was telling everyone on a video that some people might have seen that this record doesn't sound good. And one of my customers, I published his letter. He said this customer went down to his local store, found that record along with lots of other twofers, and bought them for $15 a piece. And he can't believe how good they sound. Wow. And he said, how does that guy get away with saying that the record doesn't sound good when I'm playing it right now and it sounds great? And I said, yeah, we sell them for $500. If people pay $500 for bad sound from me, then they need to have their head examined. And of course, none of those records are ever returned, and we do get the $500 and the records don't last very long. Here's the difference. His copy didn't sound good. He didn't have the right stampers. He didn't have the right pressing. He didn't have whatever. But he's making a judgment about that album that he is not capable of making, because you don't judge an album on one copy. You've got a copy that wasn't mastered by the right person or on the right day or whatever the reason is. One copy can sound great. They look the same. The covers look the same. The labels look the same. One interesting aside about that is I used to tell people, show me two covers of the Beatles Revolver, well, not a color, Sgt. Pepper, with exactly the same color saturation. They almost always look different. They look a little faded. They look a little richer. My friend Robert Pincus, who was the guy that coined the term hot stampers in the first place, and who I owe a lot to, I won't say everything, a lot. I took some of his ideas. He's the first guy that told me that two sides of the same record don't sound good. I said, what? He goes, yeah, oh no, side one of this record is terrible, but side two is awesome. And I go, it is? And this is back in the 90s. I met the guy in about 1987. And sure enough. And so I'll tell you a funny story about that, which is when Geoff Edgers first contacted me, and he said, I'm from the Washington Post and I want to do a story about records. And people say you have records and they don't all sound the same. And I said, I'll prove it to you, Geoff. Here, I'm going to do something interesting for you. I'm going to send you a record with one good side and one not very good side. It's a Creedence Clearwater record. You may have heard Geoff.
Which one was it? Which one was it?
I think it was Bayou Country, but I couldn't tell you for sure. And it was because it was basically what we call a one-sided record. One side sounds good, one side doesn't. Hard to sell. People, when they buy a Creedence Clearwater record, typically like to be able to play both sides and enjoy it. I said, I'm going to send you this record for free, and I don't even care what your stereo is. You can have a close and play stereo. I don't care. You'll hear that these two sides don't sound the same. I sent the record to him. We had a very long phone conversation, and I liked him right away. He seemed like a nice guy. And when he got back to me, he said, wow, one side does sound way better than the other. And I said, tell that to the average audiophile, because they don't even know that. You, working at the Washington Post with no experience, now know something that 99% of all the audiophiles in the world don't know. Well, you happen to meet the guy that plays records. And when you play side two and it doesn't sound right, you notice it. So even though it has the right stampers for side two, because the right stampers are on side one and side two, they tend to kind of match up. That's why all our grades for our hot stamper records are always side one and side two. We have the white hot stamper, which is the highest graded record. That's our top copy. It less than half the time has a white hot both sides. One side will be white hot, the other side will be super hot, which is our next grade down, or closer than that. But the two sides, a lot of times when we do a shootout, we have a great side one and a very good side two, and a great side two and a very good side one when we're done. And those are our two shootout winners, one for side one on one record, one for side two on the other record. And that's just the way it came out, because for example, the person playing side two, when he's listening to the record, he doesn't know what side one was. He doesn't know what the grade for side one was. Why would he? He doesn't have the record in his hand. The record is over by the guy playing the record. That's where the jacket is. That's where the notes are. So one of the things we try to make we try to explain is that if you use rigorous testing protocols and you control for as many variables as you can, and you try to really scientifically approach this thing, you'll find that a lot of the things you believe about records just aren't true, because the records are telling you something else, and you have to listen to them. I wrote a commentary. Excuse me if I'm doing all the talking, but I don't know, you're interviewing me, so I'll keep going.
This is your show. This is what people want to see. They don't want to see me talk. They want to see you talk. So this is fantastic.
Well, I thank you very much. So I did a quote from Malcolm Gladwell about outliers on my blog, and I talked
another
about
Canadian, by the way.
A super Canadian man. Is this guy? He is as good as it gets, and we love him. And
you see how you're hanging around all these Canadians now, Tom. That it tells you something, right?
You know, I have no problem. I love Canada. It's a great country, and so yeah, Mark Stein is I'm a big fan of. And he's a wonderful, he loves music and he writes beautifully about music. I used to put some of his posts up on my blog, but you know, people don't really come to my blog to read about Mark Stein. So there was a limit to how much of that I could do. But I lost my train of thought. What was I talking about? My assistant over here is really falling down on the job. Yeah, I'm going to get another mail order bride. This one's not working out. Oh, what was it? Oh, it's gone now. Welcome to the senior moment. I've lost my hearing and I can't think straight. So
I'm worried about your hearing being lost. You know, hearing all these or having to basically pick out all these records. I know it's a joke, but I mean, how is your hearing? I mean, have you noticed a difference throughout the years?
My high frequency hearing has been gone for a long time, and I have to tell you something that
But you don't do the listening.
I don't do the listening anymore, but I did the shootout with Geoff.
Yeah.
So the shootout.
Let's talk about that, because you did the shootout. It was Kenny Dorham's Quiet Kenny, right?
Well, we didn't do a shootout for Kenny Dorham. We just played some copies. Now that's kind of a shootout, but we didn't have any real copies. And when I do a shootout, I make sure there's a real record in there. We had that thing from the Electric Recording Company, and we had some other Analog Productions version, whatever. We had those.
And the thing with Analog Productions, I know one thing that got an uproar on the vinyl community is when you were saying that Chad Kasem you're calling him a fucking loser, I guess is what it says here.
He called me a fucking loser. So
okay.
I'm free with my opinions, but Geoff Edgers, when he was in that video, and he said, and people were saying, Tom Port has nothing nice to say about all these wonderful professionals. And he asked Chad, yeah, but you called him a fucking loser. And I printed it. So how are you any better? And of course, the answer to that is, that's about as far as he got. He sort of let out some air. And the same thing happened with Michael Fremer, which is, when Michael Fremer calls Geoff Edgers a liar, I mean, these are the people you're dealing with. I don't want to talk about those people because really they're not part of my world, other than they make records that I like to play and then tell people how awful they are. And I do that for Analog Productions because I think they just make awful sounding records, but they're not awful in the sense that they don't play or they're noisy or something else. They just don't sound the way they should. And when you play them, you go, huh. Now that one that we did play, the Kenny Dorham, is I believe Kevin Gray mastered that, and Kevin Gray can master a record that sounds passable. I'll give it that. He's made some other passable sounding records, but I don't listen to records that are passable. I listen to records that sound great. And we sell Kenny Dorham. I know that album. And the versions we sell are amazing sounding. Why would I ever play a record that's as uninteresting as the versions they made, Analog Productions and the Electric Recording Company? My God, don't get me started. I don't even want to talk about how bad those are. That's the one where I said, this guy makes mud pies. That was the Electric Recording Company. He does make mud pies. He takes perfectly good vinyl and turns it into mud. And he has some special powers that allow him to charge $350 for records that don't sound good. How that is astonishes me, but you know.
People are all wealthier than you.
Well,
Yeah,
ERC, what is about, they limit their copies to 300-400 copies per.
sure.
So, I mean, I know there was a big controversy, and I actually did it on my channel as well. ERC was coming out with the Doors, their debut album off the
Mhm.
original tape. But it turned out it was like a Lido tape. So it was an equalized copy that they were going to press. And I did a quick little video on that. And it turns out right after that, I don't know if it's a coincidence, but it's no longer on their site. So I don't know why that's happened.
Maybe he decided that that wasn't such a good idea. I did find out a little bit about him in this sense. A friend of mine was telling, I was saying, how does this guy get master tapes? Can he really be getting master tapes? And my friend said, he doesn't know for sure, but he's heard a rumor about a guy that gets hold of a master tape, hires a courier that the label hires a courier. The courier flies across the country with the tape, brings it to him. He masters from it. They take it back, and everybody's happy. And if you're willing to pay that expense, you can get a master tape. You just
Okay.
can't put your hands on it and do whatever you like with it. Now, interestingly enough, if you do the math, you make 300 or 400, you make limited edition. Let's say you make a limited edition of 300 and you charge $350 a piece for them. The math is pretty simple. You're going to get 100 grand out of that. So you know what your costs are going in. Your costs are, say, $10,000, $20,000, whatever. Then you're going to get a total of $100,000 retail, and you only have to sell 300 copies to do it. Well, that's a pretty good business model. As Chad said, what's the difference between his $350 record and your $50 record? He said $300. And Chad's very good at subtraction. He understands that one number is higher than the other, and he can tell you the difference between those two numbers. He can't tell you the difference in the sound quality because
Bernie Bredman and the mastering that's done.
What?
Chad's mastering and how the engineers are doing a great job.
Oh, so here's a little something.
Well, that's the one thing too. I mean, as you probably know, if you looked at my channel, I'm friends with Bernie Grenman, I'm friends with Kevin Gray, and Miles Scholl, Abbey Road, and Sean. So I mean, I know all these mastering engineers. I think they're great people. They're doing they're doing the best they can. They're very, very passionate about making a great sounding record as well.
Can I interrupt? Bernie Grumman in the article says, you know what? Making a record is hard. We're doing the best we can. They give us the tape, we make the record. It's out of our hands at that point. We do the best we can. All I'm saying is, if that's the best you can do, I would rather buy some other records. Thank you very much.
But here's the thing. But here's the thing. Like with Bernie Grunman. I mean, you look. Let's give you an example. So Steely Dan's Asia, the original, the AB 10006, whatever it is, that was mastered by Bernie Grunman.
How about AA 1006? That's the original.
Well, AA 106 is the original. I thought it was AB was the original.
No, because they switched it to AB, and I had.
Sorry, I meant okay, yeah, I meant.
I had a customer who wanted to buy the AA, and I said, we don't sell records based on their catalog numbers. We sell records based on their sound quality. And not to interrupt your story, but I always wanted to say to this person, and I kind of wrote about it a little bit. This was your chance to really learn something. I'm going to send you an AB. It's going to sound better than your AA if you have one. If you don't have an AA, go buy one. They're on Discogs. You're having trouble finding one. And then you'll learn something, because it's not about the catalog number. Now, there may be more AA copies that sound better than AB copies. That's certainly possible, but that's not a fact. That is just something you hope to be true. And the way you find out is you actually have two records in your hand and you play them, because that's how you learn about records. You don't learn about records by reading about them or having people tell you things about them. You learn about records by playing them. And it would have been a wonderful, teachable moment. But of course, people who want originals, and they're not our customers because most of our records are not originals, just want originals. It's not about the sound quality. It's about the originality of it. And that, to me, is, if you're an audiophile, it shouldn't be about that.
Well, that's what Bernie even told me when I interviewed him like this, is like, you got to trust your ears. I mean, that's all it boils down to, is trusting your ears. And that's the thing, music is subjective. So, I mean, the stuff that you hear might be different than what I'm hearing, might be different than Michael Fremer's hearing, or Chad Casson's hearing, or, Judy's hearing for that matter as well. So getting to that as well, the equipment that you use, you're pretty consistent with your equipment, pretty consistent with your, is it a VP? I think it's a VPI turntable, I
Yeah,
want to say, is
the,
that you use?
the old
Okay.
the old Aries.
The old
But
Aries.
the
So
key is,
tell us a little bit about that setup. So I mean, how big of a room, how big of a listing room, like what is it? Give us sort of a description of it.
well, the room is, you can see a picture of it when in the video, but the room has a high ceiling, 12-foot ceiling, and it's about 20, I think it's 22 feet long, and it's about 18 feet wide. So it's a bigger room than I had my stereo in for all the years that it was in my house. I had a master bedroom that was 18 by 20, and I had it all set up. I had all sorts of room treatments all over that room. And during the day, nobody could go in there. And that was the access to the master bath. So if you wanted to use that bathroom, you were out of luck. If you wanted to take a shower, you were out of luck. I can tell you when the key thing that I learned about audio that changed everything for me was the quality of the electricity. So when we used to do shootouts in my house, the microwave was unplugged, the coffee maker was unplugged, all the computers were on isolation transformers, no lights were on in the room. We run the light in our listening room in this place in Westlake on a battery. Why? We plugged the light into the room and the sound got worse. We set up all sorts of different ways that the electricity could come in from different circuits. Then we stuck the receiver into each of these plugs, each of these outlets, and heard which one sounded the best. This one's terrible. This one's pretty good. Oh, that's the one. And then we did that with every possible combination. We had our isolation transformers in every possible circuit. And then we ran long extension cords until we found the circuit we liked. And we found the extension cords that would reach that far. And that's why when you go into my offices, there's extension cords everywhere taped to the floor. We did all these things because that is such an important part of the sound. You're basically just taking electricity and changing it into physical movement of a cone. And so the idea that you're going to go home and you're going to go in your listening room and your wife is watching TV and your kids have their, video games on, you're just never going to hear sound that's as good as we hear it because we eliminate
So so
all those things.
so when you listen to records, no kids or no wives. Then that's the number one rule.
Well, I feel bad. I've always had a dedicated room. I've always had a house that was dedicated. I've always been able to do everything I wanted to do. And I talked to people. My friend Robert Brook, for example, was just able to get out of his living room and move to another room and have control over that. But most of the people I talk to, they can't do any of those things. So when they're playing records, they're not hearing them quite the way we are. They're still hearing them. Obviously, I have no idea what the stereos of my customers sound like, but they apparently sound good enough to hear that our records sound better than whatever they've been.
So how many customers do you have on betterrecords.com? Like what do you normally have? Like how many? 1,000 customers? Like do you have a number?
If you counted people that put an order in the last year or two or three, whatever, some people just buy one record and it was my favorite. There was a guy, it was my favorite record, and I don't have the money to buy any more. Richard Metzger, famously, the guy from what is it, Deceptive Minds, something, whatever that website is that he writes for. He bought one record because he just doesn't have any money. And I get it, man. Our records are expensive, but we probably have a few hundred customers at any time. And that's plenty. And then really you have your hardcore group of customers. There might be 20 of those. And those are the guys that when the mailer comes out, when our records go up on the site, the reason they're up there for 5 minutes is if they don't have that record, they're going to buy it. They're simply just going to buy it because they know if we tell them it sounds great, it will sound great. And it's a record that we put up, which means we've curated to some degree the quality of the music. For example, if we're going to sell you a Joe Walsh record, we're not going to sell you a Joe Walsh record that doesn't sound good or doesn't have any good songs on it. We're going to sell you one of his classic records. Now, is that a demo disc? According to Chad Kassem, nobody should be buying Born in the USA because that's just a bad sounding record. Well, the people that like that album would like the best sounding version of it they can get, and we can provide that for them. But we're not going to go around telling people that Bob Clearmountain's mix for that record, which is really, let's say, unnatural on its best day, but it sounds great on the radio. And I've listened to that record, and I think it's fantastic songwriting and one of Bruce Springsteen's best. But is it a demo disc? No. But does it sound better than all the other copies you can buy? Yes. So that's why we're going to sell it. But we make no claims to audiophile sound on records that don't have audiophile sound. We just say this is the best you can do. And instead of charging you $1,000 for an amazing Dark Side of the Moon, we'll charge you a few $100s for an amazing Born in the USA, because look, this is the best we can do. It's going to sound like a CD no matter what you do, but it's going to sound like a really good CD, and the CD won't sound as good. So that's the value you're getting.
And so if a person who buys, and I've actually been a customer of yours, I actually bought the Beatles Help album years ago.
Nice.
It was a mid-'80s Parlophone,
Right.
stereo, of course. And I did a comparison of that one with I think I had a remastered Help from like 2009, I think, and the MoFi Help. And I definitely like the Hot Stamper one the best in terms of overall vocals, bass, and overall balance to that pressing. So yeah.
Well, the thing about the Mo Fidelity set, my history with that set is very deep. I bought that set and it blew my mind. The first 5 albums I'd never even heard on the British pressings, and here I was listening to Please Please Me and With the Beatles and just going, who knew these albums were so good? I haven't listened to them since I was 10 or 15 or whatever, some ridiculous age. And I just fell in love with that set, and I played it all the times, and I made a bunch of tapes of it so I could listen to it on my Walkman, if you can imagine that, which I still have, and I still enjoy. When I work out, I have a Walkman, and that's analog. And people say, oh, why don't you just get an iPod? I go, I've got all these great tapes. What do we need an iPod for? Anyway, so now I have these tapes, and now at the ripe old age, I listen to them and I go, God, I cannot believe how bright and phony and sucked out in the mid-range these Beatle records were that I put on tape. But I couldn't hear it back then. I didn't know anything. I had never heard a good Parlophone. And maybe in the 90s, when I was selling audiophile records, I was selling lots of Mo Fidelity Beatle records, because why? The Parlophones didn't sound good to me. The ones I had heard, I thought they were bright and edgy and crude and full of congestion and lots of problems. Well, something changed. My stereo got a lot better. I worked on my stereo incessantly, and we learned how to clean records better. So by the time we could clean records and play them properly, those Parlophone records, the records weren't any different, but they sure sounded different. And I think you just can't beat them. I think they are it. And anybody that reissues that record is always going to find himself on the wrong end of that stick, because it just doesn't look like it's in the cards. Now, if somebody says, are you saying that nobody can ever remaster those records and improve them? I'd say no. Just the way I can say that nobody's going to jump over the Empire State Building. Yeah. Maybe somebody will learn how to fly. I don't know, but I don't see any evidence. I tend to live in the real world of just the record I have in my hand. And when people send me links, they say, hey, they're doing this and they're doing that. My God, when they half-speed mastered Abbey Road and remixed it, I said, if this is what they're doing to the Beatles catalog, somebody needs to go up there and stop them. They're doing a lot of damage. This record doesn't sound like Abbey Road. It's the worst sounding Abbey Road I've ever heard. Abbey Road is a wonderful album. Nobody needed to remix it, but if you do remix it, don't destroy it, and don't half-speed master it so that all the bass is wonky. Which is another, when I played my Abbey Road back in the day, back in the 80s.
This is the MoFi of Abbey Road you're talking about.
Well, I'm talking about Giles Martin's remix just recently, but the MoFi Abbey Road, when you play Here Comes the Sun, and the bass comes in, and he goes, and it's this blurry, blobby, crappy bass. Well, when I was playing that record back in the 80s, I thought, well, I guess they just don't know how to record bass very well. And secondly, my stereo is not that good, so maybe the bass is better and I'm just not playing it right. And then one day you get a parlophone and the bass is awesome and tight and goes deep. And you say, oh, that half-speed mastering stuff. No wonder the bass is terrible, because half-speed mastered records always have terrible bass. And Abbey Road is a perfectly good example of it. There's just no shortage of half-speed mastered records with bad bass. And for some reason, I've never figured this out, audiophiles don't seem to notice. Why that is, nobody can tell me. But if you have your Beatles help and you play it and you just listen for the bass on your MoFi, just listen to nothing but the bass, and then play your parlophone and listen to nothing but the bass, I don't think there's any comparison. Just half-speed master. Kevin Gray, your man, Kevin Gray will tell you how bad half-speed mastering is.
And I've asked him this in my interview. He's not a big half-speed mastering fan. It's funny because it's subjective. Because I mean, Kevin Gray doesn't like half-speed. I've had an interview with Miles Scholl. I'm not sure if you've seen that one, and of course he likes half-speed mastering. So again, it depends on the ears. It depends on a lot of different variables as well. And I mean, apparently Sir Paul McCartney likes half-speed because he's approving these records as well that are coming out of Abbey Road.
Well, here's what I would say about that. I don't want to talk about whether somebody likes something or not. If I can give you something that I think sounds better and explain to you or tell you what to listen for, as I've just done, for example, then I think you're in a better position to make that judgment than if we talk about generalities. If we talk about specifics, for example, if I say that Abbey Road, I have a test on my blog where I say, just listen to the voices. I forget what track it is. And on MoFi, they're maybe 5 or 10 feet further back in the mix when they're in a big room with the speakers pulled out and all the rest of it the way they are in my studio. And then you put on a regular parlophone and they're right there in front of you. Now, is that something that's a matter of taste? Well, I've actually heard that it is. I've heard that some records that were maybe I shouldn't say this. Let's say somebody took some of my records to some other people's houses and played them. And the person said, I don't like it. It's in my face. I like it more naturally reserved and spacious. And it's just, these hot stampers are just jumping at me and hitting me in the head. And it's not relaxing for me to listen to that sound. And of course, that's our sound. We want the sound to jump out, not be phony, not be unnatural, not be souped up. But, if you listen to the guitar on Taxman, that guitar solo in the right channel, it better jump out, because that's what it does on every copy. Sometimes it jumps further, and sometimes it's even more clear and more meaty, but it's always jumping out. That's the mix. Why wouldn't you want that to happen? I mean, that's what the Beatles put on the tape, and everybody agreed was a good idea. I don't want to compress it. I don't want to soften it. I don't want to mellow it out. I want it to take over your life. We talk about all the time. My records are not for sipping wine and smoking cigars. My records are to take over all your attention and take you someplace you can't go any other way, because that's the experience I've had with records, and that's what I want my records to do. I've sat my mail order bride, who's still sitting in this room over here, listening to me and giving me some hand commands, which I don't understand, but she's sitting over there. But I have sat her down a number of times and said, even this music, you don't even like this music, AC/DC Back in Black, but I've got to play you this because this sounds like the band is in my room. I'm going to play it as loud as it will play, which is way louder than you would like it to play, but I'm going to play it that loud because that's the way it sounds great. And there's no talking. There's just immersion into this song and the sound of the bass and the drums and that grungy guitar, you will become an instant AC/DC fan when I put this record on and you hear it the way I get to hear it.
So Judy, are you an AC/DC fan now?
Well, I am when I hear it on his stereo,
No.
but certainly not on the radio.
No, if that music's playing somewhere, she can, well, that doesn't sound like the one you played me. Well, of course it doesn't. That record was $1,000.
What about Dionne Warwick?
Or Dionne Warwick. I give you a good example. We played Dionne Warwick. She has a song called "Anyone Who Had a Heart," and it goes, "Anyone who had a heart
Would know that I love
could look at me and know that I love you." And so this song, I tell you my story. So one day we were doing a shootout for this record, and the guy that worked for me at the time, his name was Dave, great guy. He doesn't work for me anymore. He's found a better job, which I'm sure there's lots of better jobs than playing records for me. But back in the days when I was doing most of the shootouts, and we put this record on, and I'm telling you, I got this feeling in my chest where it got tight, and I started to a little do like this, and tears started. I mean, my eyes started to well up, and I just was feeling so deep.
Wow.
And she was just so right there, and all the emotion of that song was coming out, and it was going right into me. And he stopped and he said, "Hey man, are you okay?" And I go, I'm not okay. I mean, this song is just getting to me. And give me a minute. And I got a minute, and I composed myself, and I said, you know, I have emotions. People don't think I do, but I actually have emotions. So funny thing, I'll relate that story to you. We have a video, and I'm holding a copy of Time Out, and I'm saying, "This record sucks all the life out of this wonderful music." Well, that's what it does. And that's the way I feel about it. When I play Time Out, I feel like I'm in the room with this band, and they're just making this wonderful music. And I play this audiophile version, and I feel like, what happened to that band that I liked? These guys are terrible, and the instruments don't sound right. What happened? Well, that's what an audiophile record is to me. It's a record that somebody did something to, and it doesn't work anymore. They broke it. They broke the sound. So that'll get some people writing comments, I guarantee you.
Well, we'll see what happens there. So one last thing, and so we'll leave it at that. It's been a very incredible, I guess, almost hour here. You're betterrecords.com. So someone buys a record from them, they don't like the sound. You cover their costs for shipping and everything to get back to you. It's a money back guarantee. Like, how's that work?
Well, I actually put that up on my blog today because I wanted to make sure that some people who had written on the Steve Hoffman forum were saying things like, well, you know, he asks you questions, and maybe if you don't give him the right answers, I said, look, come on, folks. Credit cards. Your credit card company will give you your money back no matter what. They're not going to say, "Oh, Better Records, what do you think? Should we give him his money back?" No, take the money out of my account, put it in his. That's the end of that story. Pack it up, send it back. Now, if you're in America, I'm happy to pay your shipping back. We get so few records back. We get maybe probably 1%, I'm going to say, just because it's so rare. And if somebody really is worried about that, I remember Michael Frember saying, "Oh, people aren't going to bother to pack it up. It's a big hassle." I go, you know, if I sell you a record for $500 and it doesn't sound good, are you going to say, "Well, I guess I'm out $500? No, that record's coming back to us. And records do come back. There's also records that I feel like somebody couldn't play it quite right. Maybe they didn't adjust their VTA properly. Who knows what the problem is? We don't concern ourselves with how people play our records. That's up to them. If they don't like it, even if they don't like the music, they don't like the cover, the surface noise is worse than they expected. Any reason, I don't care what the reason is, there has never been a time we will not give you your money back. And if if you buy a record overseas and you say, "Well, it's cost me $50 to send it back," I go, "Well, that's unfortunate, but I didn't tell you to live overseas." That's your problem. Yeah.
Well, Tom, thank you so much. This is an inaugural YouTube interview. I think it's going to get a lot of interesting comments. I'm excited to see the comments later on today when it gets uploaded to my channel. I'll send you a copy as well, and you can enjoy the comments. If you want to comment back, let me know.
Well,
It was a real, it was a real honor getting to interview you first in the vinyl community on YouTube. This has been a great chat. I want to thank you again. Thank you to your mail order bride, Judy, for setting this all up as well. I appreciate it, Judy. And if you're ever in Vancouver, if you guys are ever in Vancouver, you know where to hit me up. We got to go for lunch.
You'll take us to Stanley Park, right?
Well, you know what? Last year there was a big coyote problem in Stanley Park. So if you want to get eaten by coyotes, then sure. But I'm not wanting to. So we'll go out for a nice lunch on the harbor somewhere, English Bay or something. Guys, thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much.